When nations speak of free trade, the language sounds noble. It is dressed in words like fairness, openness, and mutual prosperity. But behind the rhetoric often lies a very different reality. The United States has for decades presented itself as the champion of free trade, yet in practice, it enforces rules that consistently tilt the balance in its favor. It is the age-old paradox of power. Those who hold it seldom play by the same rules they demand from others. What is called free trade then becomes less about equality of exchange and more about control of direction. We must understand the illusion at work here. The illusion is that markets are inherently free. They are not. Markets are built, designed, and constantly reshaped by those who dominate them. Regulations, tariffs, sanctions, intellectual property laws, these are not neutral tools. They are weapons, often dressed up as protective measures. And when a superpower wields them, they become mechanisms not of fairness but of manipulation. To accept them at face value is to mistake a cage for a corridor of freedom. India has recognized this contradiction. For too long, emerging economies were expected to accept the framework imposed on them as though obedience were the price of entry into the global system. But what is the point of entry if it chains you at the gate? What dignity is there in a partnership where one side dictates the terms and the other is expected to comply silently? The hypocrisy becomes clear when the same nation that accuses others of protectionism builds walls of its own whenever its interests feel threatened. This is not just economics, it is psychology. Power sustains itself through narrative. If you can convince others that the game is fair, even while you rig the rules, then you win twice, once through profit and once through belief. It is this belief that enslaves weaker economies, not the tariffs themselves. Once you internalize the idea that you cannot resist, you stop resisting. That is the deeper strategy behind the illusion of free trade, to condition nations into thinking they have no alternative but submission. But illusion only works until it is named, and India has named it. By challenging the unfair trade measures openly, India has punctured the myth that America alone sets the moral standard of global economics. It is a reminder that what is presented as universal truth is often just a particular interest, and that recognizing this distinction is the first step toward real sovereignty. The deeper message here is not limited to governments or markets. It applies to every dimension of life. Whenever someone tells you the game is fair, ask who wrote the rules. Whenever someone preaches freedom, look closely at the price tag. True fairness, true freedom, requires the courage to see through illusions and then the resolve to resist them. India's defiance is not merely an economic maneuver. It is a statement to the world that power does not define truth and that no nation should accept chains disguised as agreements. And that is the call for us all, to never confuse comfort with freedom and never mistake control for fairness. For only when we see the illusion clearly do we have the chance to live and trade in truth. Would you like me to expand key point 2 next into the 500-word intellectual lecture style segment so the flow of your speech begins to take fuller shape? Here's the 500-word expansion of key point 2 in the style you want. When we talk about sovereignty, we often think of flags, borders, armies, and governments. But sovereignty is not merely political, it is also economic. Without the ability to make independent economic choices, a nation's political freedom is reduced to a performance, a facade that hides its dependence. And this is where trade restrictions, sanctions, and agreements imposed under pressure reveal themselves as tools of control. They are subtle, but they cut deeply. They do not openly conquer a nation. Instead, they shape its decisions, limit its choices, and corner it into submission. The truth is that modern dominance does not always look like invasion. It looks like dependence. If a powerful nation can ensure that your industries rely on its markets, your technology on its patents, and your exports on its approval, then it doesn't need to occupy your land. It already occupies your future. This is why economic sovereignty matters more than ever. Without it, the flag may wave, but it waves under another's wind. India has begun to resist this kind of subtle domination. By rejecting unfair measures and asserting the right to chart its own economic course, India is sending a message that sovereignty cannot be outsourced. The world has witnessed how sanctions and tariffs are used as instruments of fear, warning smaller nations that defiance carries a cost. Yet, the greater cost lies in silence, because silence accumulates into a culture of dependence. Every time a nation accepts an unfair rule without protest, it reinforces the belief that the powerful are entitled to dictate and the weak are condemned to obey. But sovereignty requires sacrifice. To resist manipulation means enduring pressure, bearing criticism, sometimes even suffering temporary setbacks. Yet these are the growing pains of independence. Think of it like an individual who refuses to live according to someone else's script. At first, there is friction, even loss, But over time, that choice builds strength and authenticity. Nations are no different. Economic sovereignty demands courage, because it is always easier to compromise than to confront. But easy choices rarely build dignity. This is where the deeper psychology comes in. Dependence is not just structural, it is mental. The powerful want weaker nations to believe they cannot survive without compliance. And the moment that belief is broken, the spell loses its hold. India's refusal to accept unfair trade restrictions is not only an act of economic policy, it is an act of psychological liberation. It is the decision to believe in its own resilience, to trust that it can thrive without constantly seeking approval from those who claim to lead the world. And this lesson applies to every one of us. In life, as in trade, there will always be forces that try to corner us, to define our choices, to tell us what we must accept. But sovereignty, whether personal or national, is the refusal to let others decide your destiny. The powerful can restrict your options, but they cannot strip you of the courage to resist. The point is simple yet profound. True independence is not declared on paper, it is lived in action. And when a nation chooses to endure the storm of defiance rather than accept the comfort of submission, it reminds us all that sovereignty is not a gift handed down by others, but a right earned by courage. Would you like me to continue with key point 3 next, so the momentum of your speech keeps building in a seamless arc? Here's the 500-word expansion of key point 3 in the style you asked for. The deeper battle in trade disputes is not just fought in numbers, tariffs, or contracts. It is fought in the human mind, because power is most effective not when it compels, but when it convinces. When weaker economies are conditioned to believe they must accept unfavorable terms, the psychological grip becomes stronger than any written agreement. Dependence is not just an economic condition, it is a mental state. And once that mental state takes root, it becomes difficult to challenge. This is why the most powerful nations do not always rely on overt coercion. They use subtle pressure, warnings about instability, threats of isolation, predictions of collapse if rules are not followed. These strategies are less about reality and more about fear. They exploit a primal instinct in individuals and nations alike, the fear of being excluded, the fear of losing connection to the wider world. Just as a person in a toxic relationship may stay because they fear loneliness more than mistreatment, weaker economies comply because they fear exclusion more than unfairness. But this fear is manufactured. Markets do not collapse because one nation stands firm. Access to opportunity is not controlled by divine authority, it is controlled by human agreements. And human agreements can change the moment people refuse to accept them as absolute. The problem is that too many nations internalize the narrative of helplessness. They come to believe that resisting the strong will inevitably lead to ruin. And that belief becomes self-fulfilling, not because resistance is impossible, but because surrender makes it unnecessary to even try. India's defiance has broken through this mental barrier. By challenging unfair measures, it is proving that the supposed risks of resistance are often exaggerated. Yes, there is pushback. Yes, there are threats. But survival does not depend on submission, it depends on resilience, creativity, and confidence in one's own capacity. The psychology of dependence tells weaker nations they cannot endure without approval. The psychology of sovereignty reminds them that they are stronger than they realize. And it is worth noting that this is not unique to nations. On a personal level, the same principle applies. How many people remain trapped in jobs, relationships, or systems because they believe they have no alternative? How often do we convince ourselves that the discomfort of control is safer than the uncertainty of freedom? The truth is that dependence often feels comfortable because it absolves us of responsibility, but it quietly erodes dignity, and once dignity is lost, everything else begins to decay. The world is watching India not only for its economic choices, but for the example it sets. By refusing to yield, it demonstrates that dependence is not destiny. The chains are often thinner than they appear. Sometimes they are only ideas kept alive by fear. Once those ideas are shattered, new possibilities emerge. The message is clear. The strongest form of control is not physical, it is psychological. And the greatest act of liberation is to see through the illusion, to recognize that the power we fear often depends on our compliance. Break the compliance, and the illusion dissolves. Would you like me to move ahead and expand key point 4 into the next 500-word lecture style segment so the momentum of your speech keeps building naturally? Here's the 500-word expansion of key point 4 in the tone and style you want. For years, India maintained a quiet position on the global stage, often choosing restraint over confrontation. It was not weakness, it was patience. A nation of over 1 billion people, deeply rooted in history and philosophy, understands that not every battle is worth rushing into. But there comes a moment when silence is no longer strength, when patience is mistaken for submission, and when restraint risks being interpreted as consent. That moment has arrived, and India's voice has shifted from quiet observation to firm defiance. This transformation matters because it signals more than just policy, it signals identity. A country that has historically been a target of colonization, extraction, and exploitation is no longer willing to accept even subtle forms of economic subjugation. India's refusal to bow to unfair trade measures is not just a rejection of specific tariffs or restrictions. It is a rejection of the long-standing assumption that powerful nations alone set the rules of global exchange. By speaking out, India is saying we are not here to be managed, we are here to be respected, and this awakening has consequences beyond economics. In the psychological theater of international relations, perception is power. When smaller nations see India not only surviving but thriving while resisting unfair pressure, they begin to question the inevitability of their own dependence. They start to recognize that silence is not the only option, that dignity can coexist with participation in the global system. One act of courage plants the seed for many acts of courage, and what begins as a single refusal can evolve into a global chorus. We must remember that power often relies on repetition. The repetition of dominance, the repetition of silence, the repetition of obedience. The moment one participant breaks that pattern, the entire structure begins to look less permanent. India's defiance is exactly that break in the rhythm, a disruption that forces the world to re-examine assumptions about who decides and who obeys. This is not arrogance, it is assertion. And assertion, when rooted in truth, has the power to realign balances. India is not claiming superiority, it is demanding equality. That is what makes this awakening so important. It is not a call for privilege, but for fairness. And fairness, when claimed with courage, often unsettles those who have long benefited from imbalance. But here lies the deeper lesson. The world does not change when the oppressed whisper, it changes when they declare. And declaration is what India has chosen. It is not only about standing for itself, but also about signaling to others that the old script can be rewritten, that the stage of international trade does not have to be dominated by a single voice. And so we see that India's awakening is not just national, it is symbolic. It is the reminder that silence can preserve dignity for a time, but defiance secures it for the future. The truth is simple. When a nation chooses to rise, its rise does not belong to itself alone. It belongs to everyone who needed proof that resistance is possible. Would you like me to carry this momentum forward and expand Key Point 5 into the next 500-word lecture style segment? Here's the 500-word expansion of Key Point 5 in the tone and flow you've been building. When a single nation stands firm against pressure, the world takes notice. But when that nation is as vast, diverse, and strategically vital as India, the impact is not limited to its own borders, it reverberates across continents. What India is doing is more than a local defense of its economic sovereignty. It is shifting the imagination of what is possible for nations that have long felt cornered by the weight of global powers. This is why the world is watching so closely. Because in every act of courage, there is the potential for a ripple effect. Consider what happens in psychology when one person dares to say what everyone else has been silently thinking. The silence breaks, the fear weakens, and suddenly the idea that once seemed unthinkable becomes a shared possibility. Nations, though larger and more complex, respond in similar ways. The moment one refuses to accept unfair treatment, it gives others permission to question their own submission. India's stand, therefore, is not just a matter of economics, it is a spark that can ignite broader change in the global order. And this is how multipolarity emerges, not through speeches or declarations, but through actions that challenge the monopoly of power. The United States has long shaped the terms of global trade, but its ability to do so rests on the assumption that no one will resist loudly enough to inspire others. India's defiance punctures that assumption. It proves that resistance is not only possible, but survivable. That is the kind of example that weakens the grip of fear, and once fear is weakened, the balance of power begins to shift. This ripple effect is not just geopolitical, it is deeply human. For centuries, the world has been organized around hierarchies, some nations ruling, others being ruled. But the human spirit does not thrive under domination. It seeks dignity, balance, and reciprocity. When India asserts itself, it aligns with that deeper current of human aspiration, and that is why it resonates beyond borders. People everywhere, whether in small nations or in their own personal lives, feel the echo of that courage. They see that resistance does not have to mean destruction, it can mean transformation. But let us be clear, ripples are not guaranteed. They depend on whether others are willing to see the example and follow. A ripple is potential, not destiny. It becomes real only when it is carried forward. And that is the challenge before the world today. Will other nations allow India's defiance to remain an isolated event, or will they let it awaken their own sense of dignity? History has always moved forward in waves. One action creates momentum, another builds upon it, until suddenly what was once unthinkable becomes inevitable. The courage of one can become the confidence of many. And so the message is this: India's resistance is not just India's. It belongs to the world. It is a reminder that the courage of a single voice can break the silence of many, and that when one ripple is allowed to grow, it has the power to become a tide. Would you like me to now expand Key Point 6 into its 500-word lecture style segment, bringing the whole speech to a powerful conclusion? Here's the 500-word expansion of Key Point 6, written in the same intellectual, lecture style flow as the earlier sections. At the heart of this entire struggle lies a truth deeper than economics, deeper even than geopolitics. Strength is not the ability to dominate, but the refusal to be manipulated. For too long, nations and individuals alike have confused submission with survival. They believe that to yield is safer than to resist, that to comply is wiser than to question. Yet history teaches us otherwise. Every meaningful breakthrough, whether in politics, culture, or personal life, has come not from those who yielded, but from those who resisted. Manipulation works because it disguises itself as necessity. It says you must do this, or else you will lose everything. It appeals to fear, to doubt, to the human tendency to avoid conflict. But what India has shown in defying unfair trade measures is that manipulation only holds power as long as it goes unchallenged. Once you expose it, once you call it what it is, its force begins to evaporate. That is the essence of true strength. Not aggression, not dominance, but clarity and courage. Think about the psychology of manipulation at a personal level. A manipulator does not need to chain you physically. They need only to convince you that resistance is futile. Once you believe that, you police yourself on their behalf. Nations are no different. If they are persuaded that they cannot survive without bowing to a greater power, they surrender before the battle even begins. The United States trade tactics rely heavily on this psychology, on the belief that resistance is too costly, too dangerous, too lonely. India's defiance tears that veil apart. It proves that survival is possible, that dignity is possible, and that manipulation loses its grip the moment courage steps in. This lesson matters because it transcends trade. It applies to every dimension of life where power seeks to impose itself unfairly. In the workplace, in relationships, in communities, strength is never about how loudly one can command others. It is about whether one can hold to truth even when pressure demands compromise. The refusal to be manipulated is an act of sovereignty, whether of a person or a nation. And sovereignty is the highest expression of freedom. India's stance reminds the world of this fundamental principle: dignity is non-negotiable. Economic deals can be debated, strategies can shift, alliances can evolve. But dignity, once surrendered, rarely returns without struggle. And that is why resistance matters. Not just for policy, not just for strategy, but for the soul of a nation. So the call is clear. The true measure of strength is not found in the wealth you accumulate, nor in the power you project, but in the courage you show when facing manipulation. That is the deeper meaning of India's defiance, to teach the world that sovereignty lives in the refusal to bow, and that true power belongs not to those who dominate, but to those who remain unbroken. And so let us reflect on this final truth in every age: freedom belongs to those who dare to resist illusions. For it is only in resistance that we discover who we truly are. Do you want me to now stitch all 6 expanded points together into one seamless lecture style draft so you have the full flow of the speech in one piece?